Good day, everyone. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are and however that applies. Thank you for joining me this morning. Here I am located on the west coast of Canada in Victoria, British Columbia, and I'm pleased that you could join me for one of the Organizational Excellence Specialists calendar of events webinars for this morning's topic of supply chain excellence assessment for 2023. I'll tell you in a moment about how this came about and why um, why it got my attention. I'll go through a bit of an agenda for today. First of all, I'll be speaking for about just 50 minutes, I think, 45 to 50 minutes. Hopefully, and then we'll have time for questions at the end of that. I'll run through a bit of my background and an introduction, and then the rationale for this entire presentation was the supply chain disruption that was really experienced in many parts of the world in 2021, 22, and the disruption of the likes that I hadn't seen before, and I've been observing the industry for 3 decades. And I was greatly, I have to say, somewhat shocked to see the impacts of the disruption, which prompted me to make this presentation. I'll be running through a few of the industry dynamics and some of the overall impacts of the disruption, and I'm putting an excellence frame on this, a lens of excellence on this. So I'm looking at a couple of different major actors in the supply chain. One being performance metrics for rail and what railway companies are undertaking as far as safety and excellence programs. And the same thing for ports. What sort of performance metrics ports are working towards, and the sorts of excellence programs that they may be undertaking as well. And then I'll be giving a bit of a rundown on the situation now, 2023. And then finally, I want to put just a few details and apply some elements of the organizational excellence framework. It's a framework that I've been working with colleagues at organizational excellence specialists for several years now. And finally, asking the question, is the supply chain more resilient now than it appeared to be 18 months, 2 years ago? A bit about my background, and again, I'm Eric Anderson. I spent nearly a decade in the container shipping industry on the port management side of things in the Port of Vancouver. I attained my MBA in 2006. I attained my Certified Management Consultant designation in 2007, my CMC. And I've been more than 25 years in consulting, including in quality assurance and business excellence, systems analysis, and change management. I've consulted to organizations in the private and public sectors, in sectors such as port and rail administration, transportation, law enforcement, natural resources, many sectors in Canada and internationally as well. I'm a registered organizational excellence specialist. So with this organization, I am what's known as a ROES. And I'm also a fellow of the Business Excellence Institute in Dublin. And at the same time as the above, I also am currently teaching. I'm associate faculty at Royal Roads University School of Business in Victoria. I teach in the MBA program. I teach management consulting too, and have for the last 10 years at least. So, and I should just check to make sure no one is saying that they can't hear me. Okay, good. Thank you. 2021 and 22 supply chain disruptions globally were some of the worst, if not the worst, in the history of the shipping, port, and railway industries. And that is saying something. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, as an observer of the industry for many, many years now, I was absolutely amazed at the scale of the disruption. It was particularly acute, felt particularly acutely here on the west coast of North America, but I know that there were other enormous congestion and delays occurring in other parts of the world, in ports and with the ocean carriers and the railways. And this had uh, all kinds of impacts, which I'll run through in a moment. But it appears that the disruptions were due to a combination, certainly here on the West Coast of North America. I refer to it as the WCNA, uh, of significant shifts in purchasing patterns brought on by the pandemic. I think I think it's been certainly identified in the media that people were stuck at home and just shopping online. I'm not sure that that's completely the reason for the massive increase in volumes and congestion, but that the pandemic, no question about it, brought on some very significant changes in the way the supply chain worked or didn't work really. There were labor shortages as well in all sectors, and this was no less the case in the transportation side of things in all modes. So there was an acute shortage of skilled positions in particular. And as well, here on the west coast of Canada, we had extreme weather events, one in particular, that just happened all in the middle of all this. So this caused definite impacts for all of this, as if the pandemic impacts weren't enough. So these caused high profile congestion problems affecting the entire global trading pattern, there's no doubt. And it certainly, I think I have to say, um, in my experience of working in the shipping industry, the vast majority of the population and the consumer population have really little idea and care less about the supply chain and the mechanics around running container carriers and ports and railways. It's sort of black box to them. And suddenly it gained, the industry gained some notoriety, it has to be said, certainly a high profile in the media that I'd never really seen before. And this was just kind of extraordinary that all of a sudden people were talking about the congestion being experienced globally. And the focus of my presentation is on the disruption of the WCNA, the West Coast of North America supply chains, and the steps ultimately that I think have to be taken to increase the system's resiliency. There was an event that gained an enormous amount of attention, and I won't spend too much time on it, but the grounding of the Ever Given container ship in the Suez Canal, blocking it for weeks on end, was certainly in March of 2021, high profile media occurrence. The media started to pay attention to this, and people were talking about this. In fact, it sort of became the butt of memes and jokes, but it was a serious event. It's not quite the precursor event that I'm going to be talking about the sort of impacts of, but it really was emblematic of the trend that's been occurring in the supply chain, in the container shipping industry, of these, no pun intended, ever larger uh, container vessels being placed on order and built at great volume. They're just launching more and more of these very large container carriers. And the problem, or one of the problems, is that when something goes wrong, it goes wrong in a big way. And I think, and blocking the Suez Canal for several weeks, a major supply chain trade route, had impacts that really began to continue, and certainly brought the nature of this industry and what it was dealing with to the front of the public mind. And I had just not seen this before, and certainly hadn't seen an accident like this before. the container industry does have container ships having a lot of problems out at sea, for example. But to actually sort of remove the Suez Canal from the options for shipping routes was pretty extraordinary. But it was really later in the year in 2021 that we started to get unprecedented volume congestion on the west coast of North America for Asia to US Midwest container traffic. And this had a number of sort of impacts, and it was difficult to tell symptom from underlying cause. But there were COVID-19 related port disruptions, so ports were losing labor actually to COVID, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And also at the same time, there was an Australia-China trade war in 2021 that resulted in long-term delays in Chinese ports by all accounts. So ultimately, by the latter half of 2021, there were delays to almost 2.5 million TEUs. A TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit. Some of you may be familiar with the term, but it's the containers are a variety of sizes, but 20s and 40s are the main size, and mostly these days it's all 40s, and there are a number of specialized dimension containers that beyond that. But a TEU is the standard unit for describing a volume of containers in traffic, and so those sorts of delays were fairly substantial. And Los Angeles and Long Beach, the Southern California port complex, congestion resulted, and that was started to be repeated all the way up the west coast of North America, all the way to a small town in Canada called Prince Rupert, which, while it's small and remote, it has a very sizable container facility and actually handles a great deal of US Midwest traffic through that port. And even they, although they managed to stay reasonably functional through the pandemic, my understanding is, and they were certainly in somewhat better shape than down in California. They were also part of the experiencing part of the problem. As far as Southern California and Long Beach and Los Angeles goes, 40% of the U.S. containerized goods coming into that country are through that hub. It's the 9th biggest container hub in the world, which is saying something. It's not, to be in the top 10 is really saying something as far as the sorts of volumes that are normally going through there. But the upshot of what was going on was that vessels were unable to unload. There were no berths available, no labor available, or vastly reduced ability to provide labor to ships. There was no off-dock storage available because it was completely full. No rail cars available because they already had containers on them and weren't being unloaded. So, for example, apparently would be in November or so of October, November of 21. It took 2 weeks to go from dock to rail car. And when, normally in the industry, you are happy if you can get containers from dock to rail car in one shift, or certainly 2 shifts. But for containers to be just placed on a terminal and sit there for 2 weeks before being loaded to a rail car is not a good thing. And in Vancouver, it was, for a couple of slightly additional reasons, it was actually approaching 3 weeks. These are, in the normal scheme of things, completely unacceptable time periods for a container simply to come off a ship and be loaded to a rail car and be sent onwards into the interior of the continent. And so this mass surge in volume demand, fundamentally brought on by the pandemic, was really what was accounting for this congestion. And this is a shot of Los Angeles, Long Beach, just a couple of the terminals there. Now, I mean, container terminals, when photographed, are busy places to begin with, and it's difficult to necessarily tell. But that is a very congested terminal. There's no doubt about it. I mean, ships are being serviced, but the fact is those yards are very, very full, and ultimately you get into a situation of there's no place to put anything, and furthermore, that there's no off-dock site storage left that provides any option for moving containers. So the upshot of that is that on the 25th of October, 2021, this is Los Angeles and down in Southern California, there were, I believe it was 90 plus container ships either anchored, which I believe is the yellow ones. This is from AIS data, and an organization called Marine Insight actually put this together. And so these yellow ones are anchored, and the rest are, these white ones are drifting container ships, drifting off, this is, I think, Catalina Island, which is off Los Angeles. So to have that many container ships, which normally are used to simply steaming in directly to the port immediately with no delay, going to their berth and being serviced, are now having to either anchor or worse yet, drift, awaiting some indication that they have a berth available for them. And that wasn't happening for weeks. So this was an amazing, and this was visible all the way up the west coast of North America, and I suspect visible with anchored and drifting container ships in many ports around the world. It just was an indication that this industry that previously had worked reasonably efficiency, regardless of sort of differences in port productivity, et cetera, where containers could be relied on from getting to Asia to a particular destination, let's say in North America, in a set number of hours or within a range of error of those number of hours. This was a complete blockage of the system. Yes, so by mid-December of 2021, we had 97 container ships at anchor in Los Angeles, Long Beach, just off the harbor there. I mean, that's a huge number of container ships to be anchored at all. The December 2021 on-time performance for the industry was reported at 32%. I mean, if you were running an airline and you ran an on-time performance of 32%, you'd be very unpopular, if not out of business. There is a fascinating stat that comes from Kuhn and Nagel, which was that on January 19th of 2022, the single day total TEU waiting time was approximately 11.5 million days. That is on a particular day, and they measured this, I'm reading off a note here because I need to get this correct. These are for the, Kuhn and Nagel measured this at the ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach, Seattle, Vancouver, New York, Oakland, Hong Kong, Yantian, Shanghai, Rotterdam, and 2 or 3 other ports in addition. So for ships drifting or at anchor off those ports, the containers on board those ships, all that volume, we're looking at a waiting time of 11.5 million days. Now, that's an amazing number of days for delay. It's important to note that actually the normal number is slightly over 4 million days at any given point in time. So there's always delays in the system, but this is almost triple the normal delay time. And so when you measure it across, and this is really a measure of the global impact of all of this, was that across all these ports around the world, there was this kind of level of delays being experienced. So for the shipping lines themselves, the ocean carriers, they had to make significant shifts in routings and capacity allocation. One of the big techniques or tools at their disposal is what's known as a port drop. They simply dropped calling major ports. I mean, Oakland was apparently a victim of that, if you can call it that. Oakland was dropped at a certain point in time during the sort of November through spring of 2022, where the carrier simply dropped Oakland as a call, and there were capacity allocation measures being taken as well. from their standpoint, the ports actually, despite all this congestion, um, they were handling extraordinary volumes. I mean, volumes were going through. And as well, in certainly up in my part of the world, in Canada, uh, they were coping with severe weather disruptions as well. So at the end of 2021, for the last 6 months, Vancouver handled a full year's container traffic in 6 months for a total of almost 3.5 or over 3.5 million TEU, and that is a record. Vancouver is sort of normally down around 3 approximately. They're building more and more capacity in Vancouver. It's definitely becoming larger than it used to be. Uh, Port and rail truck operations were impacted dramatically here by a November 2021 weather event called an atmospheric river, which is just, let's just say, it's a massive amount of rainfall in 2 or 3 days that caused significant medium-term infrastructure damage. And by medium term, I mean the damage was such that it took weeks and months to repair. And in the meantime, that infrastructure, and I'm referring to freeways and railways in particular, uh, was completely unavailable as a transport option. So, in fact, forget the shipping industry, but for just the average citizen, Vancouver, as a metropolitan area of 2.5, 3 million, was completely cut off from, or almost completely cut off from its main transportation network. And so no rail could reach it for a time. No trucks could reach it except through a very small routing in the United States as an alternative. It was a real problematic weather event. I'd never seen anything like it. It just destroyed two major freeways that took weeks and weeks and weeks to even just get back to some sort of repaired stage where they could actually move, well, let alone any kind of traffic, let alone container traffic on it. So this all happened at the same time. And down in Los Angeles and Long Beach, the ILWU, the Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, was unable to provide labor gangs, particularly at skilled positions such as crane drivers, due to COVID. Los Angeles, Long Beach at that time had 800 workers off. Now that's only a percentage out of 15,000, but nonetheless, they were really struggling to provide what are known as gangs to the ships, and so this all just added up in that part of the world to ships being unable to be serviced. And one of the other reasons that their ships were unable to be serviced was because railways themselves, the big US rail carriers, were themselves experiencing an unprecedented shortage of skilled labor. I mean, we've heard about skilled labor shortages, and not just skilled labor, but unskilled labor as well, through many, many sectors, down to restaurants through the post-pandemic period. It's improving slightly, but this becomes a real problem when you cannot move cargo and the supply chain just stops because you can't get enough locomotive engineers and conductors, which is a highly specialized, highly skilled position in the railway world. And the same was the case for drivers for trucks. So with not enough drivers and not enough railway locomotive engineers and conductors, no trains could move. There were loaded trains that were parked way out into the California desert and even further east. And the same was the case in Canada, where container trains were parked with containers on them, simply unable to be moved due to a lack of labor during that particular period. The, the ultimate upshot, and Fred McCaig is a writer here in Canada who covers the shipping industry, and Fred just said, reliability has vanished. Schedules, and he's referring to shipping schedules today, they're just works of fiction. And this is exactly the case as it applied back then. Just a photograph of the weather event I was referring to. This is just one of a number of enormous slides that occurred in an area called the Fraser Canyon in British Columbia. And very rugged part of the world, and it's railway tracks are hanging off cliffs at the best of times. But when something like this occurs, you simply can't take a train across it, and it took weeks to repair this. Fortunately, there was one alternative rail line, but it too was damaged. And so the upshot was that for a time, for a period of weeks, no trains could access Vancouver and service the port. So this weather event in November of 2021 was falling in the middle of, or certainly in the first couple of months of, this particularly acute congestion period caused by the pandemic. So it was a real double whammy situation. So out of all of that, ironically, 21-22 was the most profitable year for the ocean carriers in their history. I mean, it was the freight rates due to demand. Freight rates had increased to sort of between $12,000 and $15,000 US, but to get a container, a 40-foot container from Asia to North America, that's 4 times the rate it was in 2020. And so now they were coping with this congestion issue and having all their ships having to drift and be at anchor. But despite all of that, CMA CGM, the big French combine container carrier, they had a net profit, and I should just check, of 20, I believe it was almost 25 billion dollars in net profit in 2022. They became one of the largest in the top 3 for sure, and their revenues were up 33% for 2022. I mean, they just managed to make hay from these increased freight rates, and there were charges of gouging and all kinds of things going on, just as there were charges of gouging happening at the retail end of things for the average consumer during the post-pandemic period. But despite the problems, the carriers came out of it okay. The same could not be said for exporters from North America, for example, because there were no product moves or very few product moves westbound out of North America back across the Trans-Pacific to Asia, because no empty containers were being made available to those exporters. The carriers had chosen there was such demand in Asia and China specifically for those empty containers that they wanted them back as soon as possible. Do not stop to pick up cargo, ship them back empty. There's always been a bit of an empty to loaded imbalance on this trade. And in other words, somewhat more empties than actual cargo loads. That's especially the case out of Canada. But this was extraordinary to have ships going back almost completely full of empty containers. And this had a huge impact on, for example, agricultural producers like the cotton producers, almonds, which is a huge trade, very lucrative trade. The malt business for the Asian breweries, that's a big trade out of Canada. These folks could not get containers, not nearly what they needed in order to service their customers in Asia. And the other impact was that for what I would call traditional customers, the segments that originally drove the requirement for containers back in the days when the container industry was really getting going, the automobile manufacturing industry, for example, which has long relied on a really smooth running container trade of car knockdown parts coming from Asia in containers, going to an automobile plant in the United States Midwest or in central Canada. And there are some very large auto manufacturing firms, Toyota and Mazda, et cetera, who are reliant on that movement of parts. And they, and normally operating with, I think, 3 days supply or along those lines, now having to ensure that they had an inventory of parts stretching out weeks. That is not how they like to run their business on a just-in-time basis. And so the supply chain definitely was not servicing that need. And for me, where that kind of customer was always held up as being kind of the prime customer that needed needed to be serviced properly in the supply chain, it sort of represented to me the kind of diminishment, I use that just as a term, as an expression, of their segment of the market in the overall volume in favor of this kind of unprecedented allocation of volume to consumer cargo. Uh, you know, I showed the picture of the Ever Given, and they actually did an analysis of the cargo on the Ever Given that was blocking the Suez Canal, and a lot of it was, well, to quote what I recall, was lawn chairs and barbecues and patio furniture. And this was just kind of amazing that the effort involved in moving that kind of cargo and risking a major supply chain link like the Suez Canal was sort of unbelievable to me. But that's just my general opinion of the state of affairs at the time. So I want to just spend a moment on how some performance metrics of rail and what the railways are doing as far as excellence programs are concerned. Performance metrics, and I'll do the same for ports in a moment, but performance metrics wise for rail, the operating ratio is a well-worn ratio that they work towards. It's operating expenses as a percentage of revenue, and it's quite simple. And where in the 1990s, anything around 80% was considered to be good, they achieved 70% operating ratio, and you want a lower number, the lower the better. They achieved a 70% operating ratio in 2012, and it's down in the low 60s now. And they are doing this by shaving costs everywhere. And they've been shaved significantly since 2012. And this has been driven by a reduced number of carriers. In the States, there are just 4 Class 1 railways. The Union Pacific, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, which is a merged combine of 2 previously very famous rail lines, Norfolk Southern, and CSX. So all 4 companies have been shaving costs as much as possible. It's achieved via high layoffs. Labor is a third of operating expenses for the railways, as it is for many businesses, especially in maintenance crews. And they also have been for many years, this is not just a sort of 21, 22 issue, but asset stripping, line abandonment, where they're abandoning short lines that aren't profitable anymore, et cetera, as they've been doing for a long time. And this is no less the case up in Canada as well. They also use a methodology called precision scheduled railroading. That's the US term. This has resulted, it's precision perhaps, but what it's actually resulted in is very long trains with fewer employees to run them. So previously, a train of about 1.25 miles would be considered long. But now trains are getting to 2 and even 3 miles in length, and just operated by perhaps 2 people, maybe 3. But I think even that they've been trying to shave that down. Now the U.S. currently has 3 derailments every day, and not all of them make the news or cause injury, but certainly. There have been some significant accidents at times, and I'll go through a couple of them in a moment. I also did a little bit of a look at excellence programs in rail. The ISO does have a standard for the rail industry. It is TS 22163. It's based on the ISO 9001 quality management standard. None of the Class 1 railways in the United States have been recent recipients of a Malcolm Baldrige Award. Union Pacific was a finalist in 2002. That's more than 20 years ago. In Canada, we have a very established framework called the Awards for Excellence. There have been no Canadian railway recipients of the Award for Excellence, although both railway companies have in recent years won top employer awards. I was looking to see whether any of the railways in either country were were, trumpeting the fact that they had attained an ISO standard or won a Malcolm Baldrige or won a Canada Award for Excellence, and none of them certainly were publicizing that. Canadian National, CN, the other big Canadian railway, has a set of safety frameworks embedded into the business. They call it life critical rules. And also, all the railways are emphasizing sustainability. CPKC, which is Canadian Pacific Kansas City Southern, and I'll explain how that got that name in a moment, also emphasizes sustainability. All of them are experimenting and innovating with different fuels for locomotives and going electric. And there's some pretty interesting stuff that's occurring in the railway industry. There's no doubt about it, pandemic issues aside. So CPKC is involved with and a participant in the so-called CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project of Environmental Reporting. Just a moment about the safety side of things. And I have to say, the railways, if they don't trumpet their attainment of ISO 9000 or Malcolm Baldrige, they really do, from a communication standpoint, certainly a public communication standpoint, they really focus on safety. And they need to, because when something very badly goes wrong, just as I was saying about ships of the size of the Ever Given, when something badly goes wrong in the railway industry, it's high profile. There's no doubt about it. In Canada, we had, I don't have a photograph of it, but the Lac Mégantic disaster in Quebec in 2013, where a train rolled down a hill at night, unmanned, and basically destroyed an entire town. It was carrying oil, and a whole town mostly disappeared. I mean, there were dozens and dozens of people killed. In 2019 in British Columbia, we had a derailment in the Rocky Mountains, this Field Hill, and 3 young employees of Canadian Pacific were killed in that accident. And it's a challenge to run trains through the mountains. It always is. But there were standards that had apparently been, and there's, of course, these accidents get enormous investigation. And apparently some procedures had been sort of not adhered to. So let's leave it at that. And just this year, I believe it was Norfolk Southern had a major accident in East Palestine, a small town in Ohio, that is still under investigation and is the subject of many lawsuits and heartbreak for the townspeople of this small place. So so safety is necessarily an issue, and it will come out as to why these accidents occur and what can be done about them. Just looking at the same sort of thing for ports, and then we'll get into the discussion of some of the excellence principles that might apply. So for ports themselves, of course, there are lots of measures. Estimated truck waiting and flow times in Vancouver. These are being tracked by GPS and displayed on a dashboard. For the Vancouver area is a very challenging place to be a truck driver. It's extremely congested to begin with. And the other unknown for the truck driver until recently is when they get to a terminal, how long is the lineup and how long is it going to take them to be served to have their container unloaded and sent into the terminal so they can turn around and do another trip. And so that information used to be very unavailable to the trucker. Now it is becoming more available through dashboards, etc. So ports are starting to innovate, and the technology is definitely available. It's just a question of applying it. Container throughput rates, moves per hour on the ship, and landside moves. These are all fairly standard measures. Dwell time, the average time a container spends on a terminal, which of course in the period that I'm talking about, late 21 into 22, would have been a very long dwell time, much higher than average. Terminal efficiency measures such as the volume per hectare, the TEUs per longshore worker, the number of units per crane, etc. These are all measures that you can used to measure port productivity. The main thing about any port is a constraint really isn't necessarily on to do with the ship, it's on the land side, and to do with access and egress for rail and truck, and how easy or difficult it is to get more infrastructure and capacity brought online, and the amount of off-dock storage, etc. When the landside capacity is disrupted, as it was in Vancouver, for example, with the disconnection, the destruction of rail and road, the system really starts to fail, and for good reason. So I think, and to their credit, most ports are looking at their landside capacity. In a lot of ways, similar to airports are looking at their landside capacity, not so much their airside capacity. So interestingly, just on the last bullet there, despite record volumes being moved in the last half of 2021, as I said, Vancouver moved 6 months worth of containers in, a year's worth of containers in the last 6 months. By 2022, the volume congestion had actually resulted in dramatic declines in port productivity up and down the coast. Vancouver, which has always been a middling port for productivity, not brilliant, but acceptable, and for a long time it's been trying to improve that productivity. It plummeted to well down into the 300 plus range in terms of most productive ports. It was down around 320, I think, or something like that. But the same could be said for ports up and down the west coast of North America. They all dropped in productivity terms due to this congestion happening and these intractable problems of trying to resolve it. In terms of excellence programs at the port side of things, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority has undertaken and participated with the APQC, the American Productivity and Quality Center. They use a tool called the Simulation for Process Improvement, which is actually very interesting, and it supports the improvement of operational knowledge-related processes. They have a real focus on ESG, environment, sustainability, and governance. And actually, the Port of Vancouver was a recipient of the 2018 Excellence in Governance Award. And of course, if things flow from the top, having good governance is a real issue, and a very good issue. And they have a focus on excellence amongst their suppliers, particularly construction companies. So they're demanding an excellence approach or an excellence attainment amongst their suppliers for their infrastructure. Seattle administers a Sustainable Century Award to customers, tenants, and nonprofits and business partners. And Los Angeles and Long Beach simply have an objective to be the employer of choice by promoting excellence. I have to say that not one of these ports appears to have, it's very difficult to discern that any of the ports have an organization-wide approach to excellence. They just don't seem to be undertaking that kind of program at this point. So by this year, in fact, by the end of last year, end of 2022, there has been a spectacular drop in container volumes to the West Coast. It's dropped by at least a quarter. In fact, I think it's more now. Ports are back to having normal spare physical capacity. However, labor shortages do remain, and the cost of that labor in the supply chain remains high. Actually, we've had a series of strikes from port workers in both Canada and the United States on the West Coast. The Vancouver union, the ILWU, sorted things out in August, I believe, and are back to normal operations. But their several-week strike and walkout caused, again, enormous disruption and congestion. But because there were less congestion down in the States, ships were able to reroute, and Vancouver lost business as a result. But the impact wasn't quite as bad as the worst days of the pandemic. And similarly, the U.S. Also had, particularly down in Southern California, a major strike of dock workers, which has since been resolved. All this summer. So this came on top of the sorts of congestion that had been experienced a year earlier. And I think partially I'll just add that the union saw the profitability numbers for companies like CMA, CGM, and all the container carriers and said, we want a piece of that. And these sorts of profits had never, well, I shouldn't say never been experienced before, but certainly not for a long time. And in normal circumstances, the profits of container carriers who ultimately pay fees to the port and to the terminal operators, is much more razor thin, and certainly don't generate the sorts of profits that they saw last year. But the unionized dock workers, reasonably enough, said we want a chunk of that profit, and so they were in a good bargaining position by the time it happened. And I'm not quite certain of the settlement terms, but in the end, collective agreements were arrived at. The ultimate result for this year is that there are fewer anchored container ships, not none. In a previous era, anchoring would have been so rare as to represent, a significant deficiency, a quality nonconformance, causing phones to ring and people to start pointing fingers and asking questions as to why a container ship is having to anchor, unless it's maybe for 3 or 4 hours waiting for the start of a 5 p.m. shift. But to have fewer, I guess, is better than having 97 anchored or drifting. So things have improved. As I was mentioning, the ocean carriers have reverted to kind of average profitability levels of, pre-pandemic, managing overcapacity by fleet reduction, and they use something called schedule sliding and blank sailings, which is just the equivalent of canceling a sailing. And they also use a technique called super slow steaming, which turns an 11-day normal trans-Pacific trip into 15. It's just a way it actually saves fuel and reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but ultimately it's to avoid showing up at a port until perhaps congestion has eased slightly, a few days later. The other thing that occurred that was very interesting, and then I'll get into the excellent side of things, is that in April this year, Canadian Pacific and a big railway in the United States called Kansas City Southern were merged, and CP has bought the KC Southern network, which means that the traditionally east-west transcontinental railway now stretches down north-south through Mexico. That's a big strategic change, and so on a number of levels, this theoretically increases resiliency, one hopes, by adding port choices for the U.S. Midwest. In other words, through Mexico, and there are several big container ports on the Mexican coast. I just want to spend a couple of slides, and we're getting down to the last sort of 10 minutes here, on the organizational excellence framework and how it could be applied here. The organizational excellence framework deals with 9 management areas. And if you just read around in the circle there briefly, it's governance, leadership, planning, customers, employees, work processes, suppliers and partners, and resource management, with a key on performance management and measurement, and continuous improvement. So of these 9 key management areas, there are 3 that I've sort of just want to highlight as applicable in the particular situation that I'm referring to, of this high volume congestion that occurred, and not to mention the weather events that occurred that caused so much disruption. Planning is one of the key management areas, and there's a practice in the framework and this is a lengthy framework of various practices that organizations should be adopting. So planning, obviously, where you're developing guidelines for sensitivity analysis based on a risk assessment for each forecasting assumption. In a nutshell, I'd question whether actors in the supply chain had previously developed a sensitivity analysis and a risk assessment for their forecasts, and develop contingency plans for unforeseen events. Now, was the pandemic foreseeable? Good question. Was the planning for a massive volume disruption undertaken? That clearly was not, and because the results are there for all to see. A couple of methods involved in this are that you analyze the risks inherent in each of the planning assumptions and develop action plans for fast response. And so these action plans and analyzing of the risks would have, I think, pointed to, what happens if such and such causes major congestion and volume flows. The second practice I just wanted to highlight, because a lot of the, at least a portion of the underlying issue in all of this was an HR issue, a lack of labor, that the employees management area of the framework talks about a practice called encouraging employees to be innovative and take risks. And to me, that kind of denotes an all hands on deck encouragement. And in terms of dealing with these sorts of extraordinary situations and trying to develop ways of, in the case of the supply chain, getting containers, in this case, going and moving, and taking some potential risks, and I mean sort of more business risks than anything, to achieve that. And monitoring the risk profile for a particular port or a particular terminal or a particular railway, and adjusting the risk profile if the profile changes, and adjusting plans if the profile changes. So, to have such a shortage of labor that you can't run a train or that you can't service a ship clearly requires some review or revisiting of how organizations are handling their HR practices. And the third and final one that I just want to highlight a little bit is on the resource management side of things. And there's a practice called manage the security of resources that involves, among other things, mitigating the physical loss of resources. In the event of asset failure, quick response time is critical. Certainly up here in Canada, we had a physical loss of resources and of infrastructure on a huge scale. And so we had asset failure across the board. And so quick response time is critical. I would argue that while there wasn't destruction of physical infrastructure down in the United States, they still had asset failure because of the lack of HR resources HR assets to actually run their business in the face of huge volumes. And ultimately, this leads to something that I think we're probably all fairly familiar with, which is a BCP, or business continuity planning, and which is not about recovering from the disaster. That's a different plan, but how to stay in business and run your business during the disruption. And again, now to their credit, the actors certainly in the Canadian context during the massive infrastructure destruction, they actually scrambled and managed to find ways to get product moved and service ships, etc. But there was still a huge disruption to it. So staying in business during a disruption, I think, again, needs to be revisited. So finally, I want to ask the question, is the system more resilient now? Maybe the question should be, have the industry actors implemented programs and taken steps to become more resilient? Is the supply chain capable of withstanding the next system shock? An extreme weather event or some black swan event like a pandemic, or God forbid, a war, for example, that results in a profound change in trade and volume patterns. And by profound, I mean really dramatic changes in volumes, such that they overwhelm the system. We want to try and avoid and preempt the situation where, 90 plus ships sail from Asia with little expectation of an available berth at the other end. And all of this needs to be managed. The supply chain is a multi-agency, multi-stakeholder environment. There are a lot of actors. Some of them are government, some of them are private sector. Some have differing levels of responsibility. And in Canada, we have a huge federal oversight, federal government oversight of the port management and port administration. In the States, it's different. I believe pretty much across the board, it's run at the county oversight level, so within a state. But regardless, the um, you know, if you're talking about changes to occur, they have to be made on a multi-agency basis, and there has to be data sharing across the board. There is some data sharing going on, and has been for decades. I mean, cargo manifests and container lists have been sent in advance for a long time now, but clearly there is no berth allocation, particularly, or berth scheduling in advance, the way there is, for example, in the airline industry for gate slots. Now, it might be difficult to replicate the airline system into the shipping industry just because of the unknown nature of a particular ocean voyage and how long it may take. But that picture I showed of the AIS data of Los Angeles and the number of ships just drifting offshore, there's something wrong with that picture. The resiliency can really only be achieved if with a clear understanding of issues and skills of the issues and the skills at senior level of supply chain leadership, and that includes governments. Just state that one of the issues in Canada, I said there's federal oversight of the ports. There's also in our country a provincial level of government, and traditionally, up until very recently, the last few years, there was very little involvement of the provincial government in matters around ports and shipping and the like, because it wasn't their area of jurisdiction. However, they woke up to the fact that any problems in that business, in the supply chain business, in the ports business, really impacted the rest of the citizens of the province. And so suddenly provincial governments were having to sort of find out and learn about the supply chain and about the container industry and about ports. I mean, they build highways, and they also are somewhat responsible for, well, for example, for environmental oversight over the rail lines. So all of a sudden, they needed to be involved, and it's a good thing they are getting involved. So that is my presentation. I'd like to open it up if you have any questions. Please sing out.
Hey Eric, how you doing?
Yeah, hey Chad.
It's quite interesting in the two industries that I've been involved in the last 3 years, especially in the supply chain. It just when the pandemic hit, that just seemed to be the biggest excuse ever. Not getting
Yeah,
our stuff, and it was, well, it's COVID, and I always said,
yeah,
I always said, if I hear that one more time, I'm just gonna, it was very frustrating at a supply chain level. And then, of course, when COVID uh, relaxed a bit, then the weather events. Me being in Calgary, you can imagine all the stuff coming from the West Coast for, especially the two industries I was in. A lot of stuff come from that direction.
right.
So things seemed to clear up when COVID went away, or started diminishing a bit. But then it was the weather events, and it was COVID this, and then,
Yes.
then the rain that we received. So it was just like, wow, is this a big supply chain industry,
Surprise. Yeah,
a
yeah,
problem? And it was, two events like that. So when you your presentation really opened up, especially, the thoughts that I had back then. I knew that I knew about the ship sitting out in the ocean and stuff like that, but it really, when you put it in perspective, the challenge that they must have had, and I'm not dealing with those guys. I'm dealing with my local suppliers saying,
Yeah.
Chad,
Yeah.
we just can't get your parts. Like
Right.
we can't
Yeah.
fix your equipment, and we can't. So, one of the things we had to get ingenious with was, a lot of the people we built for. We were lucky because we were in both industries that I was in during that time. We were deemed essential. One being the food industry and one being construction. So we maintained our business. But as supply chain professionals, we struggled. Yeah, we stayed in business, but we had to do a lot of ingenious things with our clients that demand we use certain products, and had to use different products just so that we could build the equipment, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Chad, what's your sector? What business do you
Well, when this first hit, I was in the construction sector. So, like,
have? Okay.
and now I'm currently in, a manufacturing company out of Calgary, which, one of our big clients is the considered the food industry. So we do a lot of manufacturing of auger systems for, the cattle industry,
Okay. Yeah.
and that kind of thing. So the government would deemed us essential just because we had to keep those kind of
Part of the
things
food
going,
supply
right?
chain.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Gotcha.
So listening to your presentation, it's interesting how those things, it just wasn't what I needed. Might have been on one of those 97 ships that was sitting out in the
Yeah.
ocean for the longest time.
Exactly. And that was just for one city, one port. You
So,
know, Vancouver
exactly.
certainly at one point had 20 something container ships anchored. And that's a lot of product sitting out there. And if it's out there for weeks, that's a lot of product. Some of it is perishable for sure and going stale. And I know in the construction industry, I mean, I've watched various projects, towers being built or not built, as the case may be, due to an unavailability of glass. So window glass,
Yeah, that's yeah,
in huge quantities coming in from Asia, and so the concrete frame has been completed, and then it's just down tools for weeks and possibly, and in fact on one project I've sort of observed because it's across the street from me, where there's just no work going on because the next stage was glassing it in, and there's no glass available. Building glass, and this is just a huge piece of the trade, and it's all because of the container. Was because of the container congestion. The other thing, and I mentioned, was that try running a car plant. If you've always been able to, and you ever since the day you built that plant in Ontario or in Michigan or down in as far down as Tennessee, you've always been able to sort of work on a just-in-time basis with maybe 3 days supply of parts, and all of a sudden the system completely blocks up, such that you now have to make sure that you either stop the line, where cars aren't going to get built, or and ultimately you make sure that you have a couple of months supply worth of parts, which sort of defeats the purpose. And the system previously operated reasonably well in servicing that kind of manufacturing, and it just all fell apart last year.
yeah,
And for that sector, and believe me, the container carriers, they go on bended knee to the car companies because the car companies are such huge customers of the container carrier lines, um, hoping to get a slice of their business. And the car companies and the auto parts manufacturers give them a slice of the business on the predication that this your system will run like a well-oiled machine, and that these containers will get through into where we need them at a car plant a long way from here on a timely basis. And all of a sudden they're not. And
yeah.
people's jobs are on the line because, if you're shutting down the automobile line, the manufacturing line, you're laying people off by the thousands. Um, Yeah, no, it was all bad news. But you know, I've been in different sectors, and as a management consultant, I've been looking at lots of different areas of the economy over the last many years. I've been observing the container business for years after I actually was no longer working in the sector. And I've observed, my observations have been that, you know, generally speaking, the industry is run the way it always ran, which was reasonably well, had its problems, had its ups and downs, very cyclical business, especially on the shipping side. Freight rates go up and then they come back down, and profits increase or decrease. But this kind of math is just extraordinary, and it sort of upset me, and it
Yeah.
certainly shocked me, and hence I felt I wanted to put a presentation together about it. But it was just amazing to see this, how bad it had become. You know, the weather event in the atmospheric river in Vancouver, which was a pretty extraordinary bunch of moisture. It used to be called the Pineapple Express, but they've gone with the term called atmospheric river. It's just subtropical air bringing a huge amount of volume of water, and it did cause real problems. We hadn't had quite that level of waterfall in one, and you know, freeways were just falling into rivers, and the rail lines were being undercut the way the photographs show. So it caused some real problems. Anybody else got any questions? Misa or Dawn?
No, no, it's okay for me. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Dawn, I'm not sure if I'm seeing you on mute, but well, and on that note, I'd like to thank you all for attending, and uh, I hope that now this deck will be made available on the Organizational Excellence Specialists website, and I'm sure that URL can be distributed out to you if you want to have a further look at it. But I really thank you for attending today, and wherever you are, have a good day or have a good evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you
Thanks
so
a
much.
lot. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Bye now.
Thank you.